Hi, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar. This is part of a 4-webinar series on assessment in a competency-based educational system. In fact, this webinar today is the third in that 4-webinar series. My name is Sean Duncan, and I'm the Strategic Change Officer for the Center for Competency-Based Education, or CCBE, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. So at CCBE, we provide comprehensive support to schools and districts who are making the shift from a traditional approach to K-12 education to a standards-based and competency-based and standards-referenced approach to K-12 education. So this includes some foundational competency-based pedagogical supports, for example, around assessment, proficiency scales, instructional practices, and teacher observation and feedback. This also includes resources and technology solutions. So in my role as Strategic Change Officer, I work really closely with schools and districts to make sure I have a good understanding of what their needs are, what their initiatives are, so that we can jointly work to create support plans that include pedagogical training and resources, as well as technology solutions, if appropriate, to help them make that transition to a more learner-centered model. So before I introduce today's presenters, I will do that in just a moment. We have 3 of them today. A few logistical items to cover. So first off, our social media, our 2 primary ones are listed there. Twitter is @Center4CBE, Facebook, Center for Competency-Based Education. Please follow us there. We post quite a bit of content, and as we continue to build out content, things that will end up in our free resources section of our website, which is intended to be quite a bit, we do make announcements there. So it's a great way to stay in the know, not only on those resources, but also on upcoming events, future webinars, conferences that we are either hosting directly or attending and participating in. So before we jump into the introductions, one last thing listed on the screen is submitting questions to the Q&A. So please use that Q&A button here in the Zoom environment to submit questions for us. The structure for today is we have pre-recorded some content. However, the same folks who pre-recorded it are also on live monitoring those questions you submit. And then after we're finished with the playback, we'll come back on live via our screens and video and directly address those questions that you've generated and submitted to us. So in addition to the Q&A, please feel free to use the chat feature. It's a really good way to enhance the conversation around assessment in a competency-based educational system. So with that said, I mentioned earlier that this is part of a 4-webinar series. The focus today is on student-centered assessment. Depending on when you're listening to this, we do have all of these sessions recorded and in our free resources section of our website. So the others are on obtrusive assessment, unobtrusive assessment, and then calculating current summative scores. So introductions are in order here. So first up, we have Dr. Marzano leading us off. He is the co-founder and chief academic officer of Marzano Resources. He is the founder of the Marzano Academies. We are lucky and fortunate to have Dr. Marzano as the Chief Academic Officer here at the Center for Competency-Based Education. During his over 50 years in education, he's worked with educators in numerous roles, including as a speaker, a trainer, and a consultant. He has authored, obviously, numerous books and articles. Those have covered topics like assessment, like the focus of this 4-part webinar series, instruction, writing and implementing proficiency scales, which is actually the focus of another webinar series, which you can find on our website under free resources. And obviously, topics related to competency-based education. In fact, Dr. Marzano's work in CBE stretches all the way back to 1992, which as of the time that we're recording this is 30 years. So really, we would argue that nobody has more longevity and influence over competency-based education than Dr. Marzano. So next up is Allie Kemp. She is a former K-8 educator. She has a passion for competency-based education and guiding systems change in schools. So her passion for CBE was born from a desire for more equitable, accurate, and skills-based data in her own classroom within a traditional school system. So since leaving the classroom, Allie now dedicates her energy to supporting CCBE schools and districts as they utilize CBE to maximize educator impact and learner outcomes. Lastly, Matt Shea is the Executive Director of Client Services at the Center for Competency-Based Education. He is a former teacher, curriculum director, and district administrator in a competency-based district in Maine. So with that background, he's skilled in leading the shift from a traditional system to a competency-based system in both the roles of teacher as well as administrator. So he's got a fantastic perspective on what CBE looks like on the ground. So welcome, Matt. And I will turn it over to Dr. Marzano, Allie Kemp, and Matt Shea.
Okay, so as part of our extended discussion about all the different kinds of assessments that we want to use in a competency-based classroom, one of the things that's most critical for developing student agency and really giving your students a sense of ownership and participation in the process of their own education are student-centered assessments. So we like to think that our best classrooms are ones where students are equally engaged in their own education. And so this is kind of a key way of making sure that students can be as involved as possible and as informed about what's going on and what they're learning and what comes next. So we're going to talk today about two different kinds of student-centered assessments, which are self-assessments and student-generated assessments. So student self-assessments are really important because this is where the agency for students is really born and operates in your classroom. So this gives students an opportunity to actually sit down and reflect on their own progress with what we're learning about, self-report their perceived proficiency, so actually tell you and tell their teacher about how they feel they're doing and what they feel they know and can do. It allows them to make predictions about their future growth, but what they need to do to achieve proficiency, and then set goals that are appropriate for themselves and basically making a plan for how they're going to get there. So this allows them to gain that agency over their own learning and actually be active participants in it instead of recipients of the instruction. So there is a lot of research behind the efficacy of student self-assessment and the student's ability to assess and report back on how their learning is going. So John Hattie, an educational researcher, conducted the same study about this two separate times, in 2009 and 2012. And he took 138 independent variables that were commonly thought to be associated with student achievement, predicting their achievement and actually tracking alongside it. And then the second time he did it, he rounded it up to 150 independent variables. So this is a lot of different things that we tend to think of as things that we can do in our classroom that are going to improve achievement or at least predict how well students are going to be doing with their learning. And the variable that had the greatest impact, the greatest effect on measured achievement both times, number one, was student self-reported grades. So students actually assessing and then reflecting and then reporting back on, here's how I feel I'm doing. Here's my proficiency level on this particular topic. And this is why I think it's going that way. And this is what I know and what I can do. That's the
I'm going to jump in here for a second, if you don't mind.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Bob.
You know, what always, it just amazes me that when we talk about student-centered assessments, in this particular part, you know, student self-assessment, it seems so foreign in the K-12 world. It's like, this is what a crazy idea. Except a lot of those same people, you know, they reference John Hattie's work, which has been going on for decades. I first found out about his work by 1987, I think, and I've actually had a chance to interact. I met him in Melbourne years ago, and have had chances of interacting with him. And as you said, in 2009, in 2012, 2009 was the book Visible Learning. 2012 was Visible Learning for Teachers. It was the #1 rated variable in both of those. I mean, this is, yeah, people have criticized his meta-analysis, and that puts a whole bunch of things together. Well, that's the nature of meta-analysis. But boy, you sure can't criticize it in terms of its thoroughness. He's been doing this for years. He has a team of people. And just to update this a little bit, in 2015, he didn't do another book. He did a report. And in that, student self-reported grades, that's what he calls it. But well, here, let me pick up the one piece I forgot. But you got it right. In 29, he just called it student self-reported grades. In 2012, he called it that again, but he also added the part of students setting their own goals. You know, so when he went deeper into the literature, so that's the part they're doing. 2015, updated the list again. I think it was like up to 190 variables or something by that time. And student self-reported grades dropped from 1 to 3. Now you may think, oh, what happened? Actually, #1 though was teacher reports of what students did. You know, which if you watch our whole series, you're going to see these are all meshed together. You know, and it held the third place. I mean, that's amazing consistency when you think about it. I mean, there's so much research behind this as a general construct that it's kind of it doesn't make any sense for this not to be a critical part of what we do. Matter of fact, I think in one of his writings, or maybe he said this, he said, you know, these correlations are so high, one has to ask, why do we test them so much? Why don't we just ask them if we really want to know what they know? So I just think this is a massive area here. It's so powerful.
So let me jump in there a little bit to follow that, Bob. I think one of the reasons that we as teachers are kind of amazed by it and kind of wonder about it is, why would I'm thinking as a teacher point of view, why would I ask my kids how they're doing on their work? You know, because I know kids, and all they're going to do is they'll say they're at an A or they're at 100. And it's wild, because when we actually do this in the classroom, in my experience anyway, they underreport their grades.
Yeah, I think you're
like
right.
They're not good at saying, okay, yes, I have this. They're like, well, I'm pretty sure, but you know, I'm going to hold myself down here a little bit and I need more work. And the teacher comes back, it's like, no, Matt, you're actually you are at that particular level. And I find that to be fascinating, that kids will never, well, not never, mostly will not over-report their grades. They'll under-report their grades, and then be able to say why they think they need more evidence and more work.
Yeah.
And you never think of that until it actually happens.
Yeah, particularly in a CBE classroom. No, they won't over-report in a CBE classroom, because they know that if there's no penalty for saying, I have no idea, I'm lost. You know, that's not a penalty at all. That's just where they are, you know, and that, so this, like I said, this is such a powerful area, and it meshes so well with the CBE classroom.
I think we're going to see a scale in the next slide, Allie.
Yes, and I just wanted to,
that is. So yeah, go right ahead.
And you know, I just want to add, I had the same experience as you, Matt, in my own classroom of, you know, when getting students to self-reflect and report on their own learning, and they would always say, well, I don't know that, I can't do that. And that's one of the biggest, most powerful pieces of this and of all of CBE is that you're teaching them to look at evidence to make their decisions instead of their gut feeling maybe, or their, insecurity. They teach them, look at the evidence and tell me, what do you know? What can you do? And, I think students are often very surprised themselves, having sat in a seat where I'm convincing a second grader, you do actually know this multiplication fact because you keep saying it correctly, in all these different things. And they're like, oh, wow, look at me. That's usually where the side that they err on. And all of this data and research, like our number one question with education, one of the things we're trying to do is accurately be able to know and report and communicate to others, like what does the student know, and who knows that best? The student knows that best. And like Dr. Marzano was saying, the teacher knows too. They know better than the test and better than the tools what it is that the student can do, and that's what we're kind of getting at with all of this. So, and like we were saying, it's most effective when you combine that practice with goal setting, follow it up with the student being able to set a goal and say, okay, because of this evidence about where I am, here's what I'm going to do next and how I'm going to do it. So one of the best ways of actually functionally doing this is something we call a personal tracking matrix, which is actually a tool that we create for students or with the student, where we take the actual proficiency scale itself. Then what's on the right here is a proficiency scale. It's an example one from, Algebra 1 about solving linear equations. So we can take our actual proficiency scale that has everything fleshed out in the different levels. Our 3.0 skills, being able to solve our linear equation. We have our 2.0 level skills, our foundational skills, which there are several different points and vocabulary terms. And then even the 4.0 of what would it look like to be going beyond proficiency. And we actually will take this and turn it into a tool that a student can use to track their own learning. Now, if you haven't yet learned a lot about proficiency scales, we do have a whole series of other trainings, other webinars that have to do with proficiency scales, how to create them, how to, make them better, and how to use them in your classroom. So that would be something that you should definitely check out if you haven't seen it yet. But this is an example of a scale that we can use, isolate our individual learning targets for our students. That might be something like, a learning objective for one lesson would be pulled from this scale. And then you can convert those learning targets into student-friendly language, and then give that as a tool to a student that they can use to track their own progress and evidence of that progress. So this is an example of what a tracking matrix would look like that comes directly from that scale on the previous slide. So what you can see here is along the left side, those two columns on the left, we have all the skills from that scale listed out, and they're actually attached to a number that is the level from the scale. So we have several skills on the level 2 area of the scale. And these include, if you start at the bottom and kind of go up, you can see the different vocabulary terms, and then you can see the different foundational skills. I can convert an equation into slope-intercept form. I can graph this equation. I can find the intersection point of two linear equations. So those are all the foundational skills, disparate, discrete skills that then combine to help provide the foundation for our level 3 skill, which is finding the point, solving the equations that satisfies, this intersection point. And so then we have the level 4 skill of actually taking that skill from level 3 and then creating real life situations from it. This is our going above and beyond, using that more in-depth knowledge to apply it to a situation. And then as we go across, we have our different levels of rating. So a student can actually take a pencil or a highlighter and shade in where they are with that topic. Shading in the box of I'm still confused. Our second one of I've learned some but not all, and then I've got this. And then as they go, especially once they get to the I've got this now level, then we're asking them to write in on the right what piece of evidence, what activity that you've done, in class shows your level of proficiency, whether it's at a 3 or still below, or at the I've got this level or still below. What have you done that can provide evidence that agrees with your own self-assessment?
By the way, that little scale there looks simple, and it is, but it took a long time to develop that. We tried all different variations. At one point, we had a scale with 4 levels, that where one was, I know this even more than I was taught, but it just didn't work. And it's easy for students to get, I've got it, or I know some of it, but not all of it, or I'm lost. It's straightforward. They get it. So these, like I say, some of these things look so simple, but it was really a lot of field testing to get to a point like this. And so the personal tracking matrix is just one of the most powerful things a teacher can do with students. Imagine every student in their data notebooks has a personal tracking matrix for every one of the topics, that has a proficiency scale. It's really powerful.
It's a great way to report for things like parent-teacher conferences or student conferences, or just conferencing in the classroom between an individual learner and a teacher, that you can have a discussion all based around that scale. And when we're talking about other types of assessments, we can use those probing questions to get at the pieces that, especially I'm thinking of the learn some but not all of this topic. That'd be a nice way to probe for kids to see, okay, is it a little or is it a lot? And you're almost there. And having a sheet like this where kids can track their own learning, I think is super valuable for many ways that we're probably not even going to discuss today, because there's an infinite number of ways I think you can use this, as long as kids are aware of what they're learning, how much they've learned, and what's next for them. It's a great tool, and they come in different names. So we call this the personal tracking matrix, and I've seen these with 4, 5, 6 different names that people use them. As long as they're being used, that's what matters.
Yeah. And if you're looking at this, if you're, someone who teaches younger students, and you're looking at this thinking like, this is so much text, this is way too complicated for a little person to handle. I can tell you, I taught, some years in primary level, and I, use tools like this, even with, first and second graders. And it doesn't have to be so much text. It doesn't have to be, so much on there. I had developed one at one point that used the same, like fist to 5 self-assessment thing that we would do, on the fly in the classroom, of holding up fingers to show their self-rating, and they would color it in. I've used it, with different school skills, and then you can sit down with the student and walk them through the skills, or even with different strategies for adding within 10. And I would actually put a picture of each strategy, and then it could be completely, non-text based, where I had the pictures of the different math strategies we were using and the fist to 5, and they kind of colored in how confident they felt using each of those strategies. So there are a lot of different ways you can adapt this for different, different subjects, different modalities, different readiness levels for students, but it's still extremely effective, because the student is actually then taking the time to sit down and think about it. And then you can use this document as a piece of evidence for the student, or as a guide for probing discussions, interviews, one-on-one times, and also, like Matt was saying, to kind of provide evidence to parents of how the student feels that they're doing in a really concrete way. So super useful. So kind of moving on from that discussion for now, unless you have anything else you wanted to add about those self-assessments. The other side of this coin is student-generated assessments. And this is something that can feel very, very foreign in a typical classroom, of actually allowing a student to suggest a different piece of evidence, a different way that they can show their knowledge and then receive credit for proficiency, essentially, from an idea that they have, or an opportunity that they would like to engage in, either along with the opportunities that already exist, or even in lieu of one of them. So this is a strategy that you can use when a student feels like their proficiency is different than what their overall score shows. They're saying, look, I know that the evidence I've submitted says that I'm at a 2, but I believe I'm actually higher. I think I'm closer to a 3 at this point, and I would like to show you that. And so you can also use it when a student has a creative idea for showing proficiency that's different from what they've already been presented with. So maybe they have a special interest that, you know, they feel they would like to show you what they know that aligns, you know, with something else that they're interested in or that they know a lot about. And or perhaps this might be something you could use when a student has needs that dictate a different method. So, you know, we've all been in those situations where you have students that know the content, but are having a difficult time showing you using the opportunities and the tools that already exist. So you might find a different way that lines up better with those students, that student's skills or their readiness, that either, you know, the teacher can kind of talk with the student and say, hey, would you rather do it this way? Or the student can actually be trained to approach the teacher with that opportunity and say, I'm better with this type of project, and I would like to use that type of project to show you what I know.
It takes them a while for it to sink in that they're being out. I mean, so it's, again, it's a foreign concept. As students in K-12, we're used to, well, the teachers are going to assess me. They're going to give me a test. That's their job. You know, but once they get really that the teacher's asking me to show what I know, you know, and if I think I'm a certain level, how can I demonstrate that to the teacher? And there'll be rigor in it because the teacher's the one that, you know, will say, well, nah, good example, or no, you can't go there. But some really, you know, very creative things that makes students more interested in the content. My favorite example is an old one. It was at a high school level, and a teacher was working with polynomials, and used a version of student-generated assessments where they could, you know, demonstrate that they know polynomials. And one student was a big fan of football and realized that the quarterback ratings every year, every game that are put out, that's a big polynomial. So just, and that you know, small step to football really got the student interested in polynomials, you know, and it just became very concrete. Oh my gosh, all these ratings that come out and, you know, affect whether players play or not, and their salaries, et cetera, et cetera. That's a polynomial. So once they get it, well, it's really, again, really exciting, you know, that and I think quite surprising what they come up with as ways to demonstrate that they know.
Yeah, it can be pretty powerful. I had a similar experience. I taught Spanish for a while as well, and we were talking about in one of my higher level Spanish classes and with middle schoolers, we were talking about the use of rhyme and meter in poetry and songs. And I had a student who was not connecting with the songs that I was using because they were more like popular music, things like that. And what he did is he went home and brought me the same analysis, but it was using the Spanish sections of Broadway songs from In the Heights that was written by Lin-Manuel Miranda before he did Hamilton. And there's very cool, a lot of very interesting things. And he had gone and done that and found ways. He's like, look at all these cool ways that this, you know, writer used rhyme and meter in the English portions versus the Spanish portions. And I was like totally blown away. And it's very cool. Like if you give students the leeway to go find their own, you know, method of showing you their knowledge, they can really surprise you. But then of course, the first question that a lot of teachers will ask when they're faced with this is like, well, but how do you make sure there's like it's a high quality project that they're doing? How do you make sure that there's some kind of control over how this develops? And so this is one example of a way that you can do this. You know, you can present a planning guide like this for students to use when they have an idea, and they can actually fill this out as a way of kind of showing you that, all right, I've thought through this, and this is why this idea I have is a good, you know, perfectly valid way for me to show this to you. So the student can actually write this out and submit a planning guide to gain approval, or at the very least to go with their assessment when they turn it in to say, here's why this is a good example. And so this is such a, a more in-depth analysis for a student to have to do to prove that they thought through this, that you can almost guarantee it's going to be a good piece of evidence for them. So they can kind of elucidate exactly what the topic is, exactly what level of proficiency they believe that this demonstrates, and why it demonstrates that level of proficiency. And so this is a great way of kind of guiding them through that thinking process, the exact same way that you do as an instructor when you're developing an assessment from your proficiency scale for them. So it kind of leads them through that thinking process. So, and of course, this can be adapted for different age levels as well to kind of make it, and it can be also done, in a conversation or something with the student. Doesn't have to be something written. Students don't necessarily need to gain approval ahead of time if that doesn't work for their classroom, but depending on how it works, and what kind of students you have, you can definitely come up with a system.
Okay, so we're going to transition into the Q&A session at this point of the webinar. And as you see, Dr. Marzano and Matt Shea are on live. Unfortunately, Ali was not able to join us live today just due to a prior commitment. So the two of us are available for your questions. So we have received a few, but please know that we are actually still continuing to monitor the Q&A section. So if something just comes up right now that you want to pose to us, please feel free to submit that. So our first question is, when scales have a number of different score 2 components, is it important to address/assess each of these independently? Or is it important to assess all of these before assigning the score 3 content? Or, sorry, assessing the score 3 content.
Yeah, that's all based on the assumptions you want to make when setting up your proficiency scale. I think it's, for me, the score 2 content should be examples of what they should know, and that if they know this, it's going to help them to the 3.0 level. So for me, it's all right to say, well, wait a minute, we don't have to assess each one of these independently. They should be very, very related in terms of their content. That said, I see a lot of schools do an effective job, at saying, no, each one of these represent a specific learning target, and I'm going to assess each one of those. And you don't have to do it. You don't have to do it sequentially. And as Ali said, they could even become the target goals for a specific lesson. I actually tend to lean more toward no, you can kind of aggregate them and get a feel for, in general, how well they do in the 2.0. But I think it's more common that people consider them, as independent targets to be taught in isolation. Would you agree with that, Matt?
Yeah, I've seen that both ways. That people talk about the checklist approach to proficiency scales, and I wholeheartedly agree with you that they should lead right into the 3 pretty easily, so you kind of do it in the aggregate. And starting right off, some people might have too much in the 2-level scales, that it easily becomes a checklist at that point. And that's where I kind of advise that, like you mentioned, like getting a feel for what the foundational pieces so they can attack the 3-level more complex stuff is where I tend to lean. Although at the beginning of using proficiency scales, I really want to, if it's in the scale, kids should be able to know it, not necessarily individually, as the questionnaire says, but definitely in an aggregate point that they should be able to know all those things. The second part about those things, about assess all of them before assessing the score 3 content, I think there's a lot of overlap going in there, especially when they get more of that 2-level content. I think you kind of naturally go to that more complex stuff. So it kind of just overlaps where they move into the 3. They still be working on some of the 2, but it gets a little fuzzy right when they're working on the 3 stuff. I'm not sure if you agree with that, Bob.
No, I got it. If you look at the 3 webinars we did on proficiency scales, what we noted in one, if not all of them, is that you should update your proficiency scales. And that's how you find out whether you update it or not. You say, wait a minute, there was so much score 2.0 content here that, you know, they just kind of, it was like walking through the swamp, you know, so we don't need all of these elements here. And eventually you get to the place where there's a nice balance, you know, that what's on there is important. It's not too much. They call it kind of the Goldilocks rule, not too hot, not too cold. Wasn't it Goldilocks? So I got that right? In the Three Bears. Yeah, that's right. I got it right. Yeah, not too hot, not too cold, but just right. Same thing with score 2 content. Not too much, not too little, but just
Agreed.
about right.
Agreed.
Yeah.
See, I know I was a literature major, actually. Aren't you impressed?
I was thinking when you said about the swamp, all I could think about was the alligator we talked about in the last webinar. So
Okay, we're not talking about the alligator. You've got to watch the other webinars to get the alligator story.
I'm gonna do a shameless plug in a minute, maybe after this next question that relates to proficiency scales again, and just show people live on the webinar where to find that. But we had a question that says, we don't have proficiency scales in place. What do you recommend as our starting point?
Okay, sorry for jumping in so fast. Do your own as individual teachers. You know, have teachers. It takes work, but it's very straightforward. I'm a teacher, math, 5th grade. I look ahead. What are my topics that I'm going to teach? And in the beginning, people just, well, here's what the curriculum says. Fine, use those. Create a proficiency scale for each one of those topics. Or what's actually better, if you have your standards, you know, and you can identify, and you can't take the standards as is. You have to identify what am I really going to focus on and measure here. Then, you know, you list 20, 25, less, more, and create a proficiency scale for each one of those. Now, you know, you can, so once that work is done, now you've got the infrastructure, you know, for most of what we talk about in terms of competency-based education. So it does not have to be school-wide or district-wide. Matter of fact, it's a good starting place to have teachers create their own. Matt, why don't you jump in on that?
no, that's exactly what I was going to say.
I knew that.
Yeah, I know.
I'll add to that one. There are some other sources of scales out there. Marzano Resources has a set that they've created called the Critical Concepts. You can go over to marzanoresources.com and get some additional info on those. There are some statewide initiatives, both in North Dakota and Alabama, where they've created open source proficiency scales that anybody can take advantage of. Not that we would necessarily advise that you adopt those as is, but use them as a starting point, and make adaptations to fit your local needs. That's work that we can certainly help folks with. Here's my shameless plug. I'm going to share screen here and just show you all on our website where you can find the other webinars that we keep referencing that are on proficiency scales. So if you go to centerforcbe.com, you'll end up on our website. Navigate to free resources at the top here, click on webinars, and you will see the assessment webinars are the ones we're right in the middle of. This again being the 3rd of the 4. We've already conducted the first 2. Those recordings are there. So 1 and 2, 3rd is the one we're in right now. And then the 4th one is coming up next week. So you can register for that one there. Immediately below those is the 3 webinar series that we conducted on proficiency scales. So please take a look at those. There's a wealth of great information in them that really is foundational to what we were covering on assessment today. So just be a great resource for you.
Plus snappy repartee with Matt and I. And
Very true.
That's right. That's right. Okay. Next question that we have is, any suggestions for schools that have made the shift to a competency-based system, but find that students and teachers want to teach a score 3.0 and then quickly move on? How can we encourage people to slow down and attempt the higher 4.0 content?
That's yours, Matt.
Yeah, that happens all the time. That I think when we first moved to more of a competency-based environment, we think we have so much to cover that we're just trying to ram right through it all. And I found myself doing that the first year that I was teaching in a CBE environment. And one of the pieces of advice that we got from our leaders was to take one of those standards. Maybe it was the next one we were going to teach. Maybe it was the one a couple of months from now, and really take some extra time to work on the 4-level stuff and work through it with kids and see that it's really not about more work necessarily, but it's about that higher level of, deeper thinking, higher level of taxonomy, however you do it in your classroom, and just see how it goes. And the next step for that would be incorporating the 4-level stuff and the 3-level stuff and kind of putting those together. And again, when I just spoke about the 2 and the 3 kind of melding over, you can easily get the 3 and the 4 kind of melding together at that point and have kids start attempting 4-level stuff without them even knowing that it's 4-level stuff. And you just get that circle of motivation at that point, because kids start providing that evidence and they're like, oh, I can do all of this. So I'm just going to keep doing all of that. So you can't really do it all at once. It can be overwhelming, especially at the beginning. But I would say really just focus on one standard first and see how it goes, make adjustments, and then do it again and try to keep putting all that stuff together would be my advice.
I'll go to the other end. If you really skip over the 2.0, you also, in a sense, rob students of the chance to see their growth.
Mm-hmm.
So to begin with the 2.0, and there will be some students who, they're at the 2.0 level or even below it. That's where the 1 and and the half scores come in. That they can do some things on their own, but they need help. And the nice thing about that is, in a CBE system, you could start with theoretically a 0. I've always said, if a student's assigned a 0, it probably says, it says even with help, they can't do it. It probably says more about the help than it does about the student. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that was the case. Getting a 0 does not preclude you from getting a 4 at the end of the unit, or 3 months later when you've had time to go back and build. So when you're really using the full breadth of the scale, you have a chance to report not only status, where I am right now, but growth. So 2 students might be at the end of a grading period, might be at a 3.0 on a particular topic, but one student started at a 1 and the other student started at a 2.5. And that's really motivating for students when they see, my gosh, I gained 2 points here.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. Another question here. Could you use these tracking matrices as a piece of evidence as an unobtrusive assessment? And this is not in the question, but maybe you guys can give context for what unobtrusive assessment is, and maybe all of the assessment types, despite our focus just on student-centered.
Yeah, in general, unobtrusive measurements are when you assign a score to a student and they might not even realize that they've been assigned a score because they've demonstrated something that's just part of regular instruction. And in a sense, I see where the person is going with the question, because the tracking matrix that the student is filling in has they filled out that internal little scale that had three values, and they provided evidence. And it could be that the student turns that in, and the teacher's the one that says, by golly, this shows that Matt really is at a 3. So in that sense, the actual scoring could be unobtrusive.
Yep.
Agreed.
You're very agreeable. Unusual.
Okay. Good. All right. Well, that is actually all the questions that we have for today. So with that said, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it. Please go ahead and register for the next webinar if you've not already done so. Follow us on social media so you know about upcoming events. And then maybe most importantly, please know that Dr. Marzano, Matt Shea, myself, the other people on our team are here to support you in your CBE efforts. So we're happy to be a partner in that work with you. So I'm going to go ahead and put my email address directly in the chat. So feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any follow-up questions, things we didn't get to today. or anything. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
Folks.